Growing up in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, I never thought much about the future. My dad worked the line at an auto parts plant for 31 years. Same shift, same lunch pail, same boots, until the soles wore clean through. My mom taught third grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just steady, honest people who paid their bills and kept their word. I was the kind of kid who climbed trees and came home with scraped knees and didn't think twice about it. My grandfather on my dad's side had served in Korea, and there was a photo of him in his Navy dress uniform hanging in the hallway of my parents' house. Every single time I walked past that photo as a boy, I'd slow down just a little. Something about the way he stood in that picture, chin up, shoulders back, like he meant it, got into me somewhere deep. When I was 14, my dad had a heart attack on the plant floor. He survived, but just barely. I remember sitting in that hospital waiting room for 6 hours, not knowing if he was going to make it. He did, but he was never quite the same after. He couldn't work the heavy line anymore, and the plant put him on light duty, which meant half the pay. My mom took on tutoring after school to cover the gap. I watched them do all of that without a single word of complaint between them, and I think that taught me more about being a man than anything else ever did. I enlisted in the Navy the summer after I graduated high school. Didn't tell anyone until the paperwork was already signed. My dad cried, which was the first time I'd ever seen that. My mom hugged me for a long time without saying anything. I ended up in the submarine service. Spent 9 years underwater, mostly in the Pacific. The isolation is something that's hard to describe to people who haven't done it. You're sealed in a metal tube with the same 80 guys for weeks at a time. No sunlight, no fresh air, no phone calls home. You learn real fast who people actually are when they've got nowhere to hide. I met my wife through a mutual friend at a cookout in Virginia Beach about 2 years into my service. She was funny and direct and laughed loud without being self-conscious about it. And I thought that was the most attractive thing I'd ever seen. Her name was Rebecca. Her parents, Jim and Carol, had both retired from the Air Force and were living in coastal South Carolina. Good people. The kind of people who still sent birthday cards in the mail and remember the names of your cousins. We got married after about a year of dating. I was 24, she was 23. We settled into base housing in Groton, Connecticut, and life started moving the way it does when you're young and busy and assume the best about everything. Our daughter Haley was born 3 years into the marriage. She was the loudest, most red-faced baby the nurses said they'd seen in a while, and I was so proud I couldn't stop grinning for about 2 days straight. Rebecca was a wonderful mother from the first minute. Patient, warm, completely natural about it. When Haley was about 18 months old, I started a small business on the side. Nothing complicated. I'd always been good with my hands, and I started doing home repairs and handyman work for people on and off base. Word spread the way it does in military communities, and within about a year I had a real little operation going. I hired 2 other guys, both with military backgrounds, and Rebecca handled the books and scheduling. She was sharp about money, always had been. We structured the business carefully, kept the finances clean, and set up a small trust for Haley's education that a friend of ours named Douglas, Haley's godfather, a guy I'd known since boot camp, was executor on. My dad's idea, actually. He always said the best thing you can give a kid isn't money. It's a structure around money that nobody can touch until they're ready for it. Life was genuinely good for a while. Then I got orders for a 9-month deployment to the Western Pacific. This was my 4th deployment overall, and Rebecca and I had navigated them before. We had a system. We had trust. Or at least I thought we did. I was about 5 months in when things started feeling off. Nothing I could put my finger on exactly. Rebecca seemed distracted on our calls, short with me in a way that felt new. I told myself it was the stress of managing everything alone with a 4-year-old at home. I told myself a lot of things. The call that changed everything came in on a Tuesday. It was my friend Warren, a guy who lived about 3 streets over from our house back in Groton. He and I had known each other for years, fished together whenever I was home. The kind of friend who shows up when your water heater breaks at midnight and doesn't ask for anything in return. He sounded strange on the phone from the first word. He said he needed to tell me something, and he was sorry, and he'd been going back and forth on it for 2 weeks before finally deciding I needed to know. He'd stopped by the house to drop off a tool he'd borrowed. Rebecca's car was in the driveway. He knocked, no answer. The door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. So he let himself in to leave the tool on the porch and heard voices from upstairs. He didn't need to say anything else. I already knew. He'd seen a man he didn't recognize come down the stairs about 10 minutes later, acting like he owned the place. Rebecca came down after him, and when she saw Warren, she froze. Warren left without saying a word. That was 2 weeks before he called me. I sat in the radio room for a long time after that call with my hand flat on my knee, just trying to breathe. 7 years. Haley. The business we built together. All of it moving through my head at once like a film running too fast. I asked Warren if he was absolutely certain about what he saw. He said yes, and that he was sorry and that he could get the name of a lawyer I should call. There was a family law attorney in the same professional building where our business handled a maintenance contract, a sharp woman named Patricia Holt who I'd met twice at building functions. Warren said he'd reach out to her quietly. I also told Warren the most important thing right then, make sure Haley was safe. He knew where she stayed when Rebecca went out, which was usually with Jim and Carol down in South Carolina. He confirmed she was there that week. That was the only thing that kept me from completely falling apart right there. I went and found Lieutenant Commander Graves, my XO, and asked to speak with him privately. He was a calm, no-nonsense man from Montana who had been through his own difficult things in life, and you could tell it in how he listened, like he was taking in weight, not deflecting it. I told him everything. He didn't flinch, didn't offer false comfort. He just nodded slowly and said, "Let's get you through this." He brought in the chaplain, a Navy commander named Father Doyle, who was about 60 years old and had the kind of quiet you only get from spending your whole life listening to people in pain. Father Doyle said very little that first conversation. Mostly he just sat with me, which turned out to be exactly right. My closest friend on a boat was a guy named Corey, a fellow petty officer from rural Georgia who had a gift for saying the exact right thing in the exact right thing in the exact wrong amount of words. When he heard what happened, he sat down next to me in the berthing compartment, slapped his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're gonna be all right. It doesn't feel like it, but you are." Then he was quiet. That was enough. Corey had been through a difficult divorce himself about 3 years prior, so he wasn't working from theory. He'd been to the bottom of that particular canyon and climbed back out, and something about that fact was more steadying than any amount of reassurance could have been. Lieutenant Commander Graves contacted Warren back in Groton and got the information for Patricia Holt. She agreed to take my case and moved quickly. Warren was already keeping tabs on things from a careful distance. Over the next 2 weeks, between mission requirements and stolen hours at the communication station, I learned more about the man who had been in my house than I ever wanted to know. He worked as a fitness instructor at a gym near the base. Went by the name Troy. Had been seeing Rebecca, according to what Patricia pieced together, for somewhere between 8 months and a year. 8 months. I'd been gone 9. I ran the math on that in my head one night and then made myself stop running it. Patricia started building the case. Warren had taken a photo the day he saw the man coming down the stairs. He hadn't said so at first, but when Patricia asked directly, he admitted it. Good man. Better friend than I deserved right then. The financial records were clean on my end because of how we'd structured everything, which Patricia said was going to matter enormously. The trust for Haley was airtight. Rebecca wasn't an officer of the business, and the divorce filing on grounds of infidelity while I was serving overseas was, according to Patricia, about as clean a case as she ever saw come through her office. There was one thing that hit me in the middle of a conversation with Patricia that I hadn't let myself think about until that moment. Haley was 4 years old. The timeline I was putting together in my head meant Rebecca's affair had started before my departure, or very close to it. I stopped Patricia mid-sentence and asked her if there was any way to verify paternity. She was quiet for a moment and then said we should address it. I couldn't finish the sentence I started next. Lieutenant Commander Graves was in the room for that call. He got on the phone himself and talked to Patricia about getting a DNA sample processed. The hospital in Groton where Haley was born had standard records on file. I didn't sleep much the next 2 nights. When the results came back, Haley was mine. I'm not ashamed to say I cried in the berthing compartment with my face turned toward the wall. Corey sat at the foot of my rack and didn't say a word. He just stayed there until I got it together, which took a while. The rest of the deployment moved in the way deployments do when you're running on adrenaline and discipline and not much else. I had a mission focus that my section chief later told me bordered on the frightening. Corey said I became a different person underwater in those last few months. Quieter, more precise, like everything non-essential had been stripped away. He didn't say that like it was a bad thing. 2 weeks before I was scheduled to pull into port, I called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring, same as always. Asked how I was, said she missed me. Asked about the food on the boat. I told her I'd be back earlier than expected and I'd call when we were closer to port. She sounded happy about it. I kept my voice even the whole time, the same way you keep your hand still on a tight depth approach. I didn't tell her what was coming. Warren had arranged everything with Patricia. The process server was a retired sheriff's deputy named Bob who did civil work on the side. The plan was simple. Bob would be parked down the street from the house. He'd wait until I was inside and had been there for about 20 minutes. Then he'd come to the door. The morning we pulled into port, I was already dressed and ready before we even tied off. I threw my sea bag in Warren's truck the minute I hit the pier. He shook my hand and looked at me the way old friends look at each other when words aren't adequate and they know it. We drove to the house. Rebecca's car was in the driveway. I had a key, obviously, so I let myself in and called out that I was home. She came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stopped when she saw me, and her face went through about 4 expressions in the space of 2 seconds before landing on something that was trying very hard to look like joy. She hugged me. I hugged her back. I noticed she was wearing perfume at 9 in the morning on a Thursday, which was not something she typically did. I didn't say anything about it. I told her I was exhausted and hungry, and could she put something together while I sat down for a minute. She said of course, and went back to the kitchen. I sat in the armchair in the living room, not on the couch, not at the kitchen table, because I'd made a decision somewhere in the Pacific that certain surfaces in that house I was never going to use again, and I just waited. She brought me coffee and toast and sat across from me, asking about the deployment with a kind of careful attentiveness that I now recognized for what it was. I answered her questions with the minimum required. I was watching the clock. At the 20-minute mark, exactly as planned, the doorbell rang. I said I'd get it. I opened the door and Bob was standing there in a plain gray jacket, professional and direct. He asked if Rebecca was home. I called her to the door. She came around the corner drying her hands again, said yes, she was Rebecca, and Bob handed her the envelope and said she'd been served. He was back in his car and driving away before she'd gotten the first page out. She read the first line and looked up at me. I had my phone out. The photo I got of her face in that moment, I keep it, not to be cruel. To remind myself on the days when it all still hurts that I did everything right. That I found out the truth and I acted with my head and not my hands, even when every nerve in my body was telling me to do otherwise. She started to cry. Said it wasn't what I thought. Said it had only been once. I told her I knew about Troy. I told her I knew approximately how long it had been going on. I told her I knew about at least one other person Warren had found out about from a neighbor who'd seen a different car in the driveway on a Wednesday afternoon 3 months ago. She stopped talking. Then I asked her the question I never in my life imagined I'd have to ask. I told her I needed to know if there was any possibility Haley wasn't mine. She said no, absolutely not. Haley was mine without any question. I told her we'd already confirmed that through other means. She realized what that meant, and the crying got worse. I told her to start getting her things together. She asked if we could talk about it. I said we were done talking. She asked about Haley. I told her Haley was with her parents in South Carolina and would be staying there for the time being while I sorted out the legal arrangements. Patricia already had temporary guardianship papers drafted for Jim and Carol to cover while I was completing my final service obligations. Rebecca looked at me for a long time without saying anything and then walked to the bedroom. She was out of the house inside of 2 hours. I sat at the kitchen table after she was gone and finished the toast, which had gone cold. Outside the window, the neighbor's oak tree was doing what it did in October, dropping leaves in that slow, unhurried way that has nothing to do with anything else going on in the world. I sat there watching it for a long time. The next morning I started making calls. Patricia first, to confirm the papers were on their way back to her. Then Jim and Carol, who already knew most of it. Carol had quietly suspected something for months, and had kept her worry to herself out of a fear of being wrong. When I told her everything, she was angry in the measured, contained way of a person who spent 20+ years in military service, and then she was very kind and very practical about Haley, and we made a plan. Jim got on the phone briefly, said very little, and what he said was enough. Then I called my parents in Knoxville. My mom cried. My dad was quiet for a long time and then said, "You did right, you kept your head." That was everything I needed to hear from him. I called Warren last, thanked him. He told me to stop thanking him, that any decent person would have done the same, and that when I was ready we were going fishing and not talking about any of this for a full 8 hours. I told him that sounded about perfect. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I expected, partly because Rebecca didn't contest much. Patricia said that was more common than people assumed in cases like this. There's a kind of exhaustion that sets in when the wrongdoing is documented and undeniable. And a lot of people in that situation just want it to be over. The business assets were protected. The trust for Haley was untouchable. Rebecca was granted some financial consideration for her contributions as a bookkeeper during the marriage, which was fair, and that was the extent of it. Custody went to me with Jim and Carol as temporary guardians while I finished out my service. Rebecca was granted supervised visitation after completing a counseling program that Patricia included as a condition. The judge, a former JAG officer himself, didn't need much persuading on any of it. I got my discharge about 8 months after I got home. Put in my papers quietly, no drama. The Navy had been good to me for 9 years, and I have nothing but respect for it. I just knew it was time. Haley needed a parent who was home. I moved down to South Carolina to be near Jim and Carol while I figured out the next chapter. I'm running the handyman business full-time now, added 2 more employees, got a contract with a property management company, put a truck on the road with the company name on the door. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest and it's mine, and it grows a little more every year. Haley turned 6 last spring. She is the funniest, most opinionated, most wildly curious child I have ever encountered. She wants to know how everything works. Last week, she asked me why boats float, and I spent 45 minutes explaining it, and she made me draw 3 diagrams. She's going to be something, that kid. About a year after everything settled, I met someone. Her name is Gwen. She's a physical therapist who works with veterans at a clinic about 20 minutes from where I live, and she has the kind of patience and steadiness that comes from genuinely caring about people, not from performing it. We took things slow. We're still taking them slow, but Haley adores her, which means more to me than I can say. Corey got out of the Navy about 6 months after I did and started driving down to visit a couple of times a year. He's thinking about relocating. I told him the cost of living down here is manageable and the fishing is outstanding. He said he'd think about it. Knowing Corey, he'll show up one day with a truck full of stuff and say he thought about it. I don't think about Rebecca much anymore. Not in anger, not in grief. What I feel when her name comes to mind is something closer to a settled, flat kind of clarity. The recognition that some things end the way they were always going to end, and that the only question worth asking is what you do with what's left. What's left is pretty good, actually. Haley is proof of that. Every morning she gets up before I do and pads into the kitchen and pours herself a bowl of cereal and turns on cartoons at a volume that is genuinely too loud. And I come out in my socks and turn it down a notch, and she looks at me like I've committed a minor injustice. And I make coffee, and we sit there together in the early light, and I think, yeah, this is what you hold on for. This is the thing the flames couldn't touch. I've thought a lot about what actually saved me through all of it. Not the legal strategy, not the timing of the paperwork, not even Warren's phone call, though all of those things mattered. What saved me was a decision I made somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, in the dark, in a metal tube with 80 other men, that I was going to respond to this with my head and not my hands. That sounds simple. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, because every instinct I had was telling me to do otherwise. 7 years, a daughter, a business we built together, a life I had genuinely believed in. When those things get taken from you, not by accident, not by fate, but by a choice someone made repeatedly over months while you were doing your job and trusting them, the anger that comes up isn't a small thing. It's a physical thing. It sits in your chest like a stone, and there were nights when I lay in that birthing compartment staring at the overhead and the stone just got heavier. But I kept coming back to one thought. Haley was watching. Not literally. She was 4 years old, and 4-year-olds aren't keeping score, but in the only way that actually matters, she was watching. The man I chose to be in the worst moment of my life was going to be the man she grew up knowing. And I did not want that man to be someone who acted on rage. I wanted her to grow up knowing someone who went through something terrible and came out of it with his dignity intact. That's the thing about integrity that nobody tells you when you're young. It's not tested on good days. Good days are easy. Integrity is the thing you either have or you don't, when everything is on fire and nobody would blame you for losing it. Warren had it. He could have stayed out of it, protected his own comfort, and not made that call. He chose differently. Corey had it. He sat at the foot of my rack and just stayed there, not because it was comfortable, but because it was right. Lieutenant Commander Graves had it. Patricia had it. Jim and Carol had it. You find out who people really are, the same way I found out who my wife really was, through pressure, through time, through what they do when it costs them something. Rebecca made her choices. I'm not going to stand here and say I understand them, because I don't, not fully. But I do understand cause and effect. Every decision that feels small and private has a weight to it, and that weight accumulates. She built something over months that had to come down eventually, and it did. And that's not something I did to her. It's something she built herself. I just happened to be the person standing there when it fell. What I built in the same period of time was different. A clean legal case. A protected trust for Haley that nobody could touch. A friendship with Warren that I will carry the rest of my life. A sense of self I can actually look at in the mirror. Haley is 6 now. She still pads into the kitchen too early and turns the cartoons up too loud and looks at me like I've ruined her morning when I turn them down. And every single time I think about the man I chose to be in that birthing compartment in the dark. And I'm grateful I chose that man. That's the only revenge that ever really mattered.